the rest of the hour. His website's earthpulse.com. Dr. Nick Begich is well-known for his work on research on HAARP, mind effects, and more. He's widely reported in these areas as an expert for many publications, government organizations, and private companies. He's testified and advised the EU, you name it. He's also been travel affairs leader. His father, of course, a famous U.S. congressman. His brother is a currently serving U.S. senator in Washington, D.C. He's been an expert witness, again, as I mentioned, for the European Parliament, best-selling author, researcher, and he's the guy that proved with the research that HAARP and weather modification was going on with the facts, not speculation. We only got a few minutes for a break here, Doc, but out of the gates, weather modification, air-based, ground-based, HAARP-based, now they admit Dubai and Saudi Arabia control the weather, the Russians. What do you think looking at this storm, Dr. Begich?
Well, once again, it's a case of not enough independent monitoring, really, to know to what extent, man might be involved in this. But this is a very technology that I've been reporting on now for 15 years, and it's just gotten better and better. In fact, in 2007, my last conversations with Dr. Easton, the inventor of HAARP, had whole new theories about weather modification, what was possible. In fact, 1,600 times less energy than he originally thought was needed when he invented HAARP. In fact, you can modify weather. So pretty profound technologies. I'm sure during the course of the hour we'll get plenty of time to talk about them. A lot of ways to do this today and even to steer it. But the problem is modeling, figuring out what the effects are. When one country plays with this, the effects are unpredictable and oftentimes disastrous.
And, of course, as you know, I'm going to just skip this network break because we got you on late. I want to give you the full time here. So you can get rolling now, Dr. Begich, breaking this down. Talk about the basics for people that don't know this is real because, ABC News makes jokes about it while separately running articles about Bill Gates having a company to create or be able to kill hurricanes. Talk about the different weather treaties. Talk about some of the basic patterns in science. Sure. Talk about the fact that, hey, this does exist. And as you said, a bunch of governments admit they're doing it. So how does that all have a chain reaction butterfly effect?
Well, first of all, going back to, the whole issue of weather modification, the U.S. has been involved in this for many, many years. In fact, I'll quote one quote. I used it in Earth Rising, the Revolution, and it's by Secretary of Defense William Cohen when he was in office back in 1997. Now, this is before the 9/11 event, and he said, and I quote, "Others are engaging in even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. Now, that's at a time before 9/11 attributing the technology to terrorist states. What he's really talking about is the idea of being able to move or manipulate weather for strategic advantage. And it was Rumsfeld who suggested that we had a treaty that we had signed with 60 other countries back in the 1970s, where we wouldn't use geophysical manipulation or weather warfare, if you will. And those treaties, he wanted to see them eliminated. But the fact is, all of those treaties from that era allow for, in most instances, domestic use, and this one in particular, meaning you could modify weather in your own nation. You just can't do it, against someone else in a warfare scenario. The problem is weather's connected. I mean, you look at a storm and where they originate and where they end up. They don't respect political boundaries, certainly.
Yeah, Japan can't pass a law that its Fukushima radiation won't hit the West Coast.
Right, exactly right. But you can manipulate, within your own boundaries, and many countries are. In fact, it's hit mainstream media a number of times. The Russians at one point, a Russian company offered to clear smoke out of Malaysia and Indonesia years ago when there was those huge fires down there that were just choking Malaysia. They agreed to, or offered anyway, to create an artificial cyclone. And that was, some mainstream media picked up on that and quickly forgot it. But, this is years and years ago. What we can do today is much more profound. In fact, even manipulating gravity waves, which is something Eastland ended his work in before he passed away. In 2007, he had delivered a paper to the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, he did work on this for the European Space Agency, NASA, even FEMA, interestingly enough, on weather modification. And in all of those instances, what he essentially showed is how to do it. And he said, look, and he said this to me, and he said this to a number of others, is he was unwilling at the state in which he recognized the technology to give it to, say, military planners, from the standpoint that the destructive effects, the unpredictable effects, were so profound, and our lack of ability to model these on a global scale. I mean, to look at all the factors that contribute to climate and the effect of climate in one place versus how it affects everything else. He recognized we couldn't do it. If we ever were going to do weather modification, it ought to be done in the open light of day. Fact is, it's not. Militaries around the world continue to experiment in this area. When you see storms like this or earthquake events like we've seen in the last few days, I get a flood of calls and people asking, was it HAARP? The fact is, it could be HAARP. It could be a number of other systems operating in the world today.
There are a bunch of HAARP systems all over the place that they even admit.
Right. This is exactly right. And the Russians is where all this started, going back to the 1970s with the woodpecker signal that many people remember. And it was that irritating noise for ham operators, and they triangulated it to these 5 transmitters in Russia. And those were the first ionospheric heaters, the very first in now over 3-4 decades of advancement. Much higher, better technology exists today.
But looking at this storm, I mean, we've had other meteorologists and people on, and they say, look, it's all manipulated already because, like you said, they've already started manipulating all over the place. And so now it's not the natural weather anymore. But obviously the sun is so powerful. I want to specifically talk about, we know about the cloud seeding, we know about that technology, we know about the Stanford Research Institute and Dr. Ben Livingston and others who by 67, it's now been declassified, 6 years ago, could make hurricanes, kill hurricanes, steer hurricanes, weaken, strengthen, all of the above, and that they'd done it in the 60s with Atlantic, hurricanes off the coast, just like this one. Now, after he came on the show a few times, they got mad at him and kind of threatened him off the show. But the point is, that was on Fox News, AP, you name it. So if in the 60s they were already messing with Atlantic storms, my issue is we know this stuff is out there, but I've had the director of HAARP on. Remember 5 years ago we were able to get him on the show, and he said, hey, I'm able to ignite the atmosphere. And then a colonel came on during the break and ended the interview. And I'm surprised that interview didn't get more attention. It was a pretty big deal. Said, because here's the colonel bossing the head of it around the civilian head, who was bragging about igniting the atmosphere with this stuff. But past that, past just ionizing things, tell us what HAARP does. And then from the patents, this is stuff that you really popularized because your scientific proof 20 years ago. What's the really advanced stuff they've got? Because HAARP's 30 years old. Right.
In terms of the things that can be done fairly easily is the moving of a jet stream. You think about that in terms of steering anything. That's kind of the root of it. HAARP can easily do this. In fact, any ionospheric heater in the world, which is what they generally refer to these, because they actually heat the ionosphere, they lift it up. Now imagine a 30-mile diameter column moving up several hundred kilometers into space, and then all the lower atmosphere moving in to fill that space. So this alters pressure systems. This can alter the flow of a jet stream around it. When you start to look at just the simplest way, and then you predict downstream. Now, years ago, back in 2002, Scientific America had a feature story on weather modification and weather generally. But one of the things they show is the jet stream coming just above HAARP, making a dog leg, and then going back south. Well, what it did is move a jet stream out of the Dallas area all the way over to Orlando, Florida, where it dropped a couple of tornadoes right in the middle of town. And many might remember that event, especially those who live in that region. But this was a very simple application, something you could do with HAARP or any of these instruments around the world. The other thing was manipulating gravitational waves. Now, that was the very last idea, which means you use a lot less energy and use a very long wavelength, which you can generate by oscillating or manipulating the ionosphere, which is this energized layer that begins about 30 miles above the Earth's surface, extending out beyond that. When you start to manipulate that, you change it from DC to AC, so it turns into this giant broadcast antenna in the sky. Now imagine you've just converted this huge energy potential both into a broadcasting system, and you've amplified the signal that you sent up. So now you can bombard the Earth. You can manipulate on a very foundational level a gravity wave, which then has reactions within the entire way in which you can manipulate, moving up the chain weather or moving in a different direction and affecting fault lines, pressure built up, where earthquakes could occur and actually causing that energy to release at a very specific time and perhaps in a very specific place. So pretty versatile instrument when you think about it. But the root of it is electromagnetic energy, the manipulation of energy across a very big bandwidth by being able to modulate the signal and actually harmonize or resonate with whatever you're trying to affect. So you can do quite a bit with HAARP, a lot which is in the mainstream literature these days.
How does the aerosol spraying fit in? Because we know there are big secret programs. They've admitted programs and they've admitted patents to have stuff added to jet fuel that then aerosolizes and things. But then a lot of the science I see says that it's actually the antennas are making regular ice crystals resonate differently and are forming larger trails. So that's why we're seeing more condensation trails that aren't even really chemtrails.
It could be either situation, but here's what happens when you introduce a chemical element, say, into an environment that you subject a certain population to. If you send a signal in and say that's considered maybe toxic in really large quantities, but not so toxic in these very small quantities, once it's in the body or into tissue, if you send a signal in that resonates or harmonizes at that same frequency, you can trick the body into believing that it's gotten a massive load of that chemical and begin reacting accordingly with the same kinds of symptoms. But when you do blood work and you check, it's a mystery illness. No one can figure it out.
Doctor, give that in layman's terms. You're talking about a binary weapon system where one part is chemical, but then being resonated with, but it's untraceable. Right,
exactly right. And so you end up with a very toxic effect or an altering effect for sure, but anyone outside of that doesn't experience it. And then when you turn the signal off and people come into that area, they get minimal levels of that toxin, so it doesn't affect them at all.
Incredible weapon.
Yeah, and it's, when you think about it, it's one of many technologies, but they're all revolve around the same idea, which is this oscillating electromagnetic fields and what you can do with them. And pulsing them, or think about it like a hammer banging a nail. The swing is the frequency, but the pulse rate is every time it taps the head of that nail. Well, you can set up a different kind of signal when you're doing this to the ionosphere, this electromagnetic layer. And, we had done that video.
I'll tell you what, stay there. There are hundreds of patents he can just list to you. In fact, I'll get him to list some off the top of his head. You can go look them up. He says, Alex, you're worried about chemicals in the food and water. That's very primitive, one level. It's electromagnetic. And then I went and did research on this. Folks, whenever I go to UT psychology department and they let me in, people we've got inside, or whenever I get intel from MIT, from scientists, it's all about frequency pulses. I mean, you go by laboratory after laboratory with monkeys strapped down, and they're just, and it's TV shows, but it's flashing lights. That's why kids have convulsions when they watch Pokemon. That's in our new issue of InfoWars magazine. They're literally lowering the brainwaves, lowering the consciousness. They are literally putting people into trance states. That's why they laugh at you. And I mean, they admit millions of dollars paid by Obama, but that's just Obama and the government. It's been going on for decades to put pro-government-run healthcare messages in sitcoms and dramas. That's one level of propaganda where they overtly, in the sitcoms, the dramas, the cop shows, are anti-gun, anti-family. You can argue, well, isn't socialist healthcare good to give poor free healthcare? But it's globalist healthcare. It's bad people. If you believe in socialism, which I don't, these are evil people that want to make you dependent so they can hurt you. And my point is, there's a war against consciousness, and we lead the world in cancer, we lead the world in diabetes, in obesity, in neurological disorders. They're killing us, and I have the White House Science Czar right here. That document cam, guys, EcoScience is on the table. It's online. It's been scanned online. Just type in text of EcoScience, John P. Holdren, right over there. And he says we're going to put stuff in the water. Well, guess what they are? He wrote that back in 1970. He's now the White House Science Czar. You hear Ted Turner say get rid of 90% of people.